The wind from the northern hills carried the first true freeze of November, sweeping through the valley of Pine Ridge, New York, and turning the dirt roads into iron. Hazel Montgomery pulled her woolen collar higher around her chin, though the fabric had worn thin over 3 winters, and offered little shelter against the gale. Her boots, patched at the heel with scrap leather by the village cobbler, crunched rhythmically against the frozen mud as she carried a heavy wicker basket filled with tallow candles and coarse salt. She had walked 2 miles from the village store, her fingers stiffening around the rough wicker handle until red welts formed across her palms. Yet she did not slow her pace. The kitchen required the salt before the sun dipped below the pine trees, and her mother rarely accepted the weather as an excuse for delayed meals. As she reached the sharp turn where the road crossed the old wooden creek bridge, she noticed a dark shape huddled against the low timber railing, nearly hidden by the drifting snow. Hazel stopped, lowering her basket to the frozen ground. An elderly woman sat on a flat stone, her knees pulled tight against her chest, wrapped in a faded cotton coat, so thin the wind blew straight through it. The woman was not shivering. She had reached that dangerous stage of cold where the body grows perfectly still, her eyelids heavy and her skin the color of skimmed milk. Hazel knelt in the slush beside her, ignoring the dampness that immediately soaked through her skirts to her knees. She took the woman's hands, finding them as cold as the river ice beneath the bridge. "Can you hear me?" Hazel asked, her voice steady and clear in the wind. "Are you hurt? Or did you lose your footing on the ridge?" The old woman blinked slowly, her breath barely visible in the freezing air. "Just cold, child," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry winter twigs. "My feet stopped feeling the ground an hour ago. I was trying to reach my daughter's cottage near the mill, but I needed to rest for just 5 minutes." Hazel shook her head, knowing 5 minutes on that stone would mean the woman would never stand up again. Without a second thought, Hazel unknotted the thick wool shawl from her own shoulders. It was the only heavy wrap she owned, mended twice at the edges with gray thread, but she draped it over the woman's shivering frame, tucking the corners tightly under her arms. "Take this," Hazel said, adjusting the wool to cover the woman's head. "The walk to the village is shorter than the walk to the mill. Go to the 3rd house past the blacksmith shop. Tell Mrs. Gable that Hazel Montgomery sent you, and she will let you sit by her hearth and give you hot broth." The old woman looked at Hazel through the gaps in the wool, her gray eyes sharp despite her weakness. "You are giving away your own warmth, young lady," she murmured, touching the mended fringe. "You have nothing but that thin jacket now, and the sun is almost down." Hazel stood up, lifting her heavy wicker basket once more. "I have a long walk ahead to keep my blood moving," Hazel replied, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You need it more than I do. The arithmetic of the matter is quite simple." Hazel turned and walked briskly down the road, her shoulders tightening as the icy wind hit her unprotected back. What she did not see, and what she could not have known, was the lone rider sitting motionless on a white horse at the crest of the hill behind her. He wore a heavy black wool coat that swallowed the light, and his wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over his eyes, shielding his face from the dying sun. He had stayed downwind, silent as a shadow, watching the entire exchange with an intensity that had not crossed his features in many decades. Nathaniel Cross, known to his reclusive people as the Vampire King, had lived for 4 centuries, and his skin was as stark white as the snow beneath his horse's hooves. His hair, long and completely white, shifted slightly in the wind where it escaped his hat. He had come to Pine Ridge under the guise of an eccentric, wealthy gentleman looking to purchase land, wanting to observe the townspeople before his official arrival forced them to put on a performance for his money. He had expected to see greed, or at least the usual cold indifference of mortals during a hard winter. He had not expected to see a girl in a threadbare coat surrender her only heavy shawl to a stranger on a public road, asking for nothing in return. Nathaniel sat very still as Hazel's small figure disappeared into the twilight. A strange sensation, like a door creaking open after being locked for 100 years, stirred in his chest, where his heart had long ceased its normal rhythm. He pulled the reins, turning his horse down the path toward the grand estate at the edge of town. He told himself the girl's actions were merely a foolish display of mortal sentimentality. He told himself this 3 times as he rode through the pine forest, and not once did he believe it. The winter night closed in completely by the time Hazel reached the iron gates of her family's home. Her breath came in thick white clouds, and her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached, but she slipped through the back door into the kitchen without a word of complaint. She handed the salt and candles to the cook, then moved quietly toward the small room under the stairs to warm her frozen fingers by the low embers of the utility hearth, entirely unaware that the white-haired stranger had already marked her face in his memory. 2 days later, the quiet routine of Crestview Manor broke apart, with the arrival of a massive black carriage, bearing the crest of the Cross family. The Montgomery name had once held great weight in the state, but years of bad investments and her late father's long illness had reduced their fortune to a fragile shell. Martha Montgomery, Hazel's mother, spent her days managing their shrinking funds while maintaining the appearance of wealth, treating their poverty like a tight dress that might split at the seams if anyone moved too quickly. She had spent the last 24 hours preparing the house for the arrival of the wealthy, reclusive landlord who had recently purchased the neighboring timberlands. Martha stood in the center of the drawing room, her posture rigid as she checked the polish on the silver tea service. "Lily, straighten your shoulders," she commanded, her voice sharp with anxiety. "Mr. Cross comes from an old family, and his fortune is larger than any in the county. This meeting must be perfect." Lily Montgomery, Hazel's older sister, adjusted the lace on her blue silk gown and smiled at her reflection in the glass. Lily was undeniably beautiful, with golden hair that caught the firelight and a practiced grace that made every movement look like a painting. "Do not worry, Mother," Lily said softly. "I know exactly what to say to a wealthy gentleman." When the butler opened the heavy oak doors, a sudden chill entered the room, carrying the scent of pine needles and old snow. Nathaniel Cross walked in, his presence immediately dominating the space. He had left his hat with the servant, revealing thick, snow-white hair that contrasted sharply with his dark velvet coat. His skin was flawless and entirely white, looking like carved marble, and his eyes were a deep, dark red that appeared black unless the candlelight caught them directly. He moved with a silent, fluid speed that felt slightly unnatural, yet entirely elegant. Martha immediately sank into a deep curtsy, her face lighting up with a practiced, bright smile. "Mr. Cross, your presence is the greatest honor our house has received this season," she said, her voice dripping with calculated warmth. "May I present my eldest daughter, Lily? She has been looking forward to your visit with great anticipation." Lily stepped forward, lowering her eyes before raising them to meet his, with a look that was perfectly engineered to charm. "Welcome to Pine Ridge, Mr. Cross," Lily murmured. "We had heard you prefer solitude, and I am glad to see our quiet valley has tempted you out." Nathaniel inclined his head, his white skin catching the light as he offered a polite, formal response. His voice was low and smooth, like velvet sliding over slate, but his expression remained completely detached. He had heard the same words from 100 women in 100 different cities over the centuries, all of them looking at his wealth rather than the man beneath it. He stepped past Lily, his dark red eyes scanning the room, and stopped when he saw a third figure standing near the shadow of the heavy window curtains. Hazel stood quietly, dressed in a plain gray gown that had been turned twice at the collar to hide the wear. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, without the curls or ribbons that adorned her sister's hair. She held a leather-bound ledger in her arms, having been called in to provide the estate's winter fuel estimates before the guest arrived. She looked up, and her steady dark eyes met Nathaniel's gaze without flinching. "And this is Hazel," Martha said, her tone flattening slightly as she moved to block Nathaniel's view. "She handles our household ledgers and accounts. You must forgive her plain appearance, Mr. Cross. She is our practical girl, always buried in numbers rather than society." The word plain hung in the quiet room like a dropped teacup, but Hazel did not lower her head. She had heard the description since she was 12 years old, and she had built a quiet wall of composure around herself to receive it without showing any hurt. Nathaniel stepped around Martha, walking directly toward the window seat. He bowed to Hazel with precisely the same depth and respect he had shown to her sister, his pale hand resting on the hilt of his walking stick. "Miss Hazel," he said, his eyes locked onto hers. Something flickered across Hazel's face, a brief look of surprise that this powerful, striking man had bothered to notice her at all. Nathaniel knew the shawl was gone, but the steady, uncalculating look in her eyes was exactly the same one he had watched on the frozen bridge 2 days ago. Dinner that evening was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to showcase Lily at every turn. Martha had seated her eldest daughter directly to Nathaniel's right, ensuring that every platter of roast duck and every glass of dark wine passed through Lily's hands first. Lily spoke easily, her conversation drifting from the latest fashions in New York City to the poetry books she claimed to read by the fire. She laughed at Nathaniel's brief, dry observations with a lightness that felt entirely rehearsed, her eyes always checking to see if her charm was hitting its mark. Nathaniel sat at the head of the long table, barely touching the food on his plate. As a vampire, human food was tasteless to him, though he occasionally raised a glass of dark red wine to his lips to satisfy the conventions of the meal. His attention was focused entirely on the far end of the table, where Hazel sat next to the old family lawyer. She spoke only when someone asked her a direct question, her answers short, precise, and entirely free of the performance her sister was maintaining. During a pause in Lily's description of a summer garden party, Nathaniel leaned forward, his white hair catching the candlelight. "I understand you manage the estate accounts, Miss Hazel," he said across the table, deliberately cutting through the regular flow of conversation. Martha's fork clicked sharply against her porcelain plate at the interruption. Hazel looked up from her roasted vegetables, her expression calm. "I do, Mr. Cross," she replied. "That must be a difficult task during a winter as severe as this one," Nathaniel said, his dark red eyes tracking the movement of her hands. "It requires a great deal of refusal," Hazel said after a short pause, choosing her words with care. "The discipline lies in saying no to things we might want, so that we have enough for the things we actually need. The rest is simply arithmetic." Nathaniel felt that small door in his chest open a bit wider at her words. It was the same practical logic she had used on the frozen road when she gave away her only protection against the frost. Before he could respond, Martha quickly redirected the conversation, laughing loudly as she praised Lily's skill at the pianoforte. The moment closed like a curtain, and Nathaniel spent the rest of the dinner listening to Lily's descriptions of musical sheets, though his thoughts remained fixed on the practical girl at the end of the table. That night, he lay awake in the master bedroom of his newly purchased manor, staring at the dark timber ceiling as the wind howled through the pines. His long life had taught him to be suspicious of human warmth. 3 decades ago, a wealthy merchant's daughter named Beatrice had smiled at him with the same radiance Lily displayed, promising him her devotion while secretly plotting to access his gold vaults with her father. When she discovered the true nature of his pale skin and his midnight habits, she had tried to sell his secrets to the local magistrate for $5,000, leaving him to realize that mortal smiles were almost always a business transaction. But the girl on the road had given away her shawl in the dark, with no witnesses who mattered, believing herself entirely alone. Nathaniel resolved that he would watch Hazel Montgomery closely over the coming weeks before he allowed himself to believe her kindness was real. In the days that followed, Nathaniel found reasons to visit Crestview Manor more often than his business required. He refused the formal invitations to sit in the drawing room with Lily and Martha, choosing instead to walk the grounds or sit in the drafty library under the pretense of examining the property boundaries. He watched Hazel from the margins of the estate, using his sharp vampire sight to observe her when she believed no one was looking. He saw her kneel in the cold mud of the stable yard to wrap a clean cloth around the cut hand of a young stable boy, working with quick, practical movements, while the boy's father thanked her repeatedly. He watched her slip 2 extra loaves of fresh bread into the coat pocket of an old woodcutter who lived in a small cabin near the northern fence, a gesture so smooth and casual it was clear she did it regularly. One cloudy afternoon, he stood in the shadow of the old carriage house and watched her sit for nearly an hour on the cold grass next to an old hound dog whose legs were too stiff to follow the hunters, simply so the animal would not have to lie alone in the freezing damp. None of these actions were performed for his benefit. She had no idea he was watching from the high windows or the tree line. Hazel moved through her day with a quiet efficiency, doing what needed to be done without looking around for approval or praise. Nathaniel began to realize that this was simply her true nature, undecorated and consistent, whether she had an audience of kings or no one at all. "You spend a great deal of time looking out the windows, Mr. Cross," Lily remarked one afternoon, as they stood on the stone veranda. She laughed, a light, musical sound that lacked any real warmth. "I fear you will find our estate quite dull if you keep looking at the fields. Hazel handles all the messy work out there. She has no taste for proper conversation or the finer things in life." Nathaniel turned his pale face toward her, his dark eyes cool. "I find dullness is a matter of opinion, Miss Lily," he said softly. "Some people speak loudly with their mouths, while others speak quietly through their actions." Lily's smile stiffened, a sharp look of frustration crossing her eyes, before she smoothed it away, realizing she was losing ground to a sister she had spent years ignoring. That evening during supper, Martha announced the upcoming winter ball, which was to take place in 3 weeks at the town hall, an event where all the wealthy families of the valley would gather. Hazel, of course, will stay behind to manage the servants and oversee the closing of the house, Martha added casually, cutting her meat with precise strokes. "Someone sensible must ensure the fires are put out correctly while the rest of us are away." Hazel did not look up from her plate, her face perfectly still, but Nathaniel noticed her fingers tighten around her silver fork until her knuckles turned white. "Surely your household is competent enough to manage for one night without her," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the room like a cold blade. Martha looked up, surprised by his tone. "Mr. Cross, Hazel has never cared for balls," she explained quickly. "She finds the music and the dancing quite tiresome. Is that not so, Hazel?" It was an order, not a question, and Nathaniel watched Hazel absorb it. She looked up, her dark eyes clear but hollow. "I find them tiresome, Mother," she said quietly. Nathaniel did not press further, but a quiet anger burned in his cold veins, and he decided right then that Hazel would attend that ball even if he had to alter the plans of the entire town to make it happen. The next morning, Nathaniel rode his white horse along the eastern boundary road, where the pine trees grew thickest. Near the old wooden bridge, he saw the same elderly woman from 3 weeks ago, struggling to carry a bundle of dry pine branches for her hearth. He dismounted immediately, his movements silent as he approached her through the snow. "Let me take that burden from you," he said, reaching for the wood. The old woman stopped, looking up into his pale face and recognizing the dark red tint in his eyes. She did not shrink back in fear. 60 years of poverty had taught her to fear hunger more than shadows. "You are the gentleman who watched from the ridge that afternoon," she said, letting him take the heavy bundle. "I remember your horse, and I remember your silence. I wonder why a man with so much wealth took so long to see what the girl gave away." "I am a cautious man," Nathaniel replied, his voice low. "I needed to know if her kindness was a rare occurrence or a habit." The old woman let out a dry laugh. "Hazel Montgomery does not know how to be anything else," she said, shaking her head. "She walked back to that manor in nothing but a thin cotton jacket that night. She took a terrible chill from it, sir. She spent 5 days abed with a fever that nearly took her breath away, though her mother barely noticed, being too busy ordering silk fabric from the city for Lily's ball gowns. That is the way of that house, sir. A kinder heart does not exist in this valley, and it is wasted on those who use it only to count their pennies." Nathaniel felt a cold fist tighten in his chest. Hazel had been sick for 5 days because of her generosity, and her family had treated her illness like an inconvenience to their ledgers. He thanked the old woman, left $3 in her palm, and rode back to Crestview Manor with a dark determination settling into his mind. He found Hazel in the cold library later that afternoon, her knees tucked under her as she sat in a window nook, surrounded by thick books on timber management and crop rotation. "You are reading about cordwood yields," Nathaniel observed, stepping into the room without knocking. Hazel started, her cheeks turning a light pink as she closed the heavy book. "Mr. Cross, I did not hear the door," she said, adjusting her simple sleeves. "My mother says you find balls tiresome," Nathaniel continued, sitting in the leather chair opposite her window seat. "Yet I suspect you find them tiresome only because you are never invited to enjoy them." Hazel looked out the window at the gray sky, her hands resting on the leather cover of the book. "My mother told me when I was 15 years old that Lily was born to marry well and bring credit to the family," she said, her voice even and free of self-pity. "She told me I was born to keep the house together so Lily could do so. It was a practical arrangement, and I stopped wishing for anything different a long time ago. It is a more comfortable way to live." Nathaniel leaned closer, his white skin gleaming in the dim light of the library. "Is it comfortable, Hazel?" he asked softly. Hazel looked back at him, her steady dark eyes filling with a sudden, rare vulnerability. "No," she whispered. "It is merely survivable." Lily Montgomery was not blind, and she had noticed how often Nathaniel's path crossed with her younger sisters. That evening, in the privacy of her mother's dressing room, Lily threw her hairbrush onto the vanity table with a loud clatter. "He looks for her, Mother," Lily hissed, her face twisted with a bitter anger she never showed in the parlor. "He went into the library today and stayed for nearly an hour while she was working on the timber books. I did not spend 3 seasons learning the piano and studying city manners just to lose a cross fortune to Hazel because she knows how to look pathetic in a gray dress." Martha adjusted her lace cap, her jaw tight. "He will not marry a household clerk, Lily," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "A man of his position requires a lady who can head a proper table. However, we cannot risk any further distractions before the ball. I will ensure she is kept too busy to leave the rear of the house." The next morning, a new list of chores appeared on the kitchen table, written in Martha's sharp handwriting. Hazel was given the task of counting every piece of linen in the attic, cleaning the silver chalices in the basement, and sorting the winter root vegetables in the cellar. Tasks designed specifically to keep her out of sight during the hours Nathaniel usually visited. To make certain, Lily slipped into Hazel's small bedroom under the eaves, while her sister was in the cellar, and used a pair of sewing shears to slice the main seam of Hazel's only decent blue wool dress, the one she wore for church services. When Hazel returned to her room that evening and found the clean, sharp cut along the back of her dress, she understood immediately what had happened. She took the ruined fabric to the parlor, where Lily was embroidering a handkerchief by the fire. "My dress is torn," Hazel said simply, holding out the split wool. Lily looked at the fabric with a look of exaggerated pity that did not reach her eyes. "Oh, how dreadful, sweet sister," Lily murmured. "It must have caught on a nail in the cellar. But since you are staying behind to watch the fires during the ball anyway, it hardly matters, does it?" Hazel did not argue. She had learned long ago that words were useless against her sister's cruelty. She carried the dress back to her small room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed. For the first time in years, the wall of composure she had built around her heart cracked, and she wept silently into the ruined blue wool, feeling the full weight of her loneliness. She did not know that Nathaniel was standing in the dark hallway just outside her door, his sharp vampire ears catching the sound of her muffled tears through the thick oak wood. He raised his pale hand to knock, but stopped himself, realizing that a king's comfort would only bring her more trouble from her family before the night of the ball arrived. He withdrew silently into the shadows, his red eyes burning with a dark promise to right the wrong. The morning of the winter ball arrived with a clear sky and an intense freeze that covered the window panes in thick patterns of ice. Crestview Manor was filled with the chaotic noise of preparation, as hair curlers were heated in the kitchen fires, and heavy trunks of silk gowns were carried down to the carriage. Hazel spent the daylight hours moving from room to room, carrying buckets of hot coals to warm her mother's dressing room and checking the inventory of candles for the servants' quarters, her face a calm mask that showed nothing of the hurt from the previous night. By 7 o'clock in the evening, the carriage had departed with Martha and Lily, leaving the manor quiet and dark. Hazel sat at the small table in the kitchen, attempting to use a bone needle to mend the clean cut in her blue dress by the light of a single tallow candle. The fabric was frayed, and her fingers were stiff from a day of heavy labor, making the work slow and clumsy. "That stitch will not hold for 5 minutes, Miss Hazel," a gentle voice said from the pantry door. Mrs. Gable, the old housekeeper who had served the Montgomery family since Hazel was an infant, walked into the kitchen, carrying a large cedar box wrapped in oilcloth. She placed the box on the table and wiped her lined hands on her apron. "I have kept this in my closet for 30 years, the old woman said, lifting the lid to reveal a magnificent gown of deep emerald silk, preserved perfectly with dried lavender. "It belonged to your grandmother. She wore it the night she met your grandfather at the state governor's dinner, and she always told me it was the only night in her life where she felt truly visible. I was waiting for the right girl to wear it, and that girl is you." Hazel stared at the rich green silk, her eyes filling with tears once more, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Mrs. Gable hurried her up the stairs to her small room, working quickly to lace her into the gown and brush her dark hair into a simple, elegant style that allowed her features to show clearly without the artificial curls her sister favored. When Hazel looked into the small glass mirror on her wall, she did not see the plain household clerk her mother described. She saw a woman who looked strong, graceful, and entirely real. "You must go to the town hall, miss," Mrs. Gable said, adjusting the green skirts. "Your mother gave strict orders, but I am old enough to ignore them for one night. A carriage from the village livery is waiting at the back gate. A gentleman paid the bill for it this morning." Hazel looked at the old servant, realization dawning in her mind. She nodded, her chin lifting with a determination she had not felt since her youth. "I am tired of staying in the shadows, Mrs. Gable," Hazel said, her voice firm. "I am going to the ball." The town hall of Pine Ridge was ablaze with the light of 200 wax candles, its wooden floor polished until it reflected the black velvet suits of the gentlemen and the bright silk dresses of the ladies. The local orchestra was playing a lively waltz, and the room was filled with the low hum of polite laughter and the clinking of punch glasses. Martha and Lily stood near the entrance, surrounded by 3 wealthy landowners, Lily's golden curls catching the light as she performed her best smile for a judge's son. The music faltered slightly as the heavy front doors opened, letting in a gust of winter air and a woman in a deep emerald silk gown. Hazel stood in the entryway, her head held high, her dark hair framing a face that carried no paint or powder, only the natural flush of the cold evening. The rich green of her dress made her skin look bright, and her dark eyes look deep, and a sudden hush passed through the nearest groups of guests as they tried to identify the striking stranger. Nathaniel Cross, who had been enduring a tedious conversation about timber prices with the town mayor, turned his head immediately as the temperature in the room altered. When he saw her standing there in her grandmother's green silk, her chin lifted against the judgment of the room, the cold wall around his ancient heart broke completely apart. He walked away from the mayor without a word of excuse, his long legs moving with a smooth, swift grace that parted the crowd before him like water, and stopped directly in front of Hazel with a deep, reverent bow. "Miss Montgomery," Nathaniel said, his smooth voice carrying across the quieted section of the hall. "You look exactly as you were meant to look, and I confess, I have spent the last 3 weeks waiting to see you in your proper place." Hazel breathed out, her hand trembling slightly as she looked into his dark red eyes. "Mr. Cross," she whispered, I was not supposed to be here tonight. Nathaniel smiled, his pale face softening in a way the townspeople had never seen before. I find I do not care for what was supposed to happen, he said, offering his arm. Will you dance with me, Hazel? I have waited a very long time to ask. Across the floor, Martha's fan snapped shut with a sharp crack, her face turning a deep crimson as she watched her practical daughter take the arm of the wealthiest man in the county. Lily's smile vanished completely, her eyes widening with a cold, sharp fury as she watched Nathaniel lead Hazel into the center of the floor, the orchestra resuming a slow, beautiful waltz that seemed to follow the rhythm of their steps alone. They moved together perfectly, the vampire's supernatural grace matching the girl's natural poise, leaving the rest of the room to whisper in astonishment. You are destroying everything, Lily hissed half an hour later, catching Hazel's arm near the refreshment table while Nathaniel was pulled away by the town council. 2 years of work, Hazel. Mother and I planned for this match, and you show up in a dead woman's green dress to steal his attention because you cannot bear to see me admired. Hazel looked at her older sister, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel small. I did not steal his attention, Lily, Hazel said calmly, removing her sister's hand from her silk sleeve. I came because I wanted to be seen for who I am, not for what I can do for the family. If Mr. Cross looks at me instead of you, that is a choice between him and his own heart, and I will not spend the rest of my life apologizing for being alive. Before Lily could respond, Martha swept across the floor, her silk skirts rustling loudly as she joined them, her expression a tight mix of anger and social panic. Mr. Cross has a great position to maintain, Martha said, her voice low, but sharp enough to be heard by the nearby guests. Hazel is a sweet girl, but she belongs in the parlor with the Ledgers, not in a ballroom. Her presence here is an embarrassment, and she has quite forgotten her place. Nathaniel appeared behind them before Martha could finish her sentence, his dark presence casting a long shadow over the mother and sister. I believe you are the ones who have forgotten, Mrs. Montgomery, he said, his voice dropping into a quiet, icy register that caused the nearby guests to step back in silence. I have watched this town for 3 weeks, and I have seen many performances. But I have seen only one person who gave her only heavy rap to a freezing old woman on the road, without knowing anyone was watching. I have seen only one woman manage your family's collapsing affairs with a skill that puts most bankers to change their methods, all while receiving nothing from her mother but public slights and a room under the stairs. The ballroom grew completely silent as Nathaniel's words traveled through the crowd. Martha opened her mouth, her face turning pale as she realized her private cruelty had been exposed to the entire county. Lily looked down at the polished floor, unable to meet the sharp gaze of the guests, who were now murmuring among themselves. Miss Hazel, Nathaniel said, his voice softening completely as he turned back to her, offering his pale hand once more. The air in this hall has grown foul with false speech. Would you walk with me in the stone garden? The frost outside is clean, at least. Hazel took his hand, her fingers closing over his cool skin with a steady grip. Together, they walked out through the double-glass doors into the midnight garden, leaving behind a ruined performance and a family that understood their hold over the practical girl was broken forever. The stone garden was quiet, illuminated by a winter moon that turned the frosted hedges into silver sculptures. They walked along the gravel path in silence, until Hazel stopped by a low granite wall, her breath rising in a small cloud. You did not have to say those things to my mother, she said softly. The town will talk of nothing else for 2 months, and my family will never forgive the humiliation. Nathaniel turned to face her, his white hair gleaming under the moonlight, his face grave. I spent 3 decades hiding from the world because a woman named Beatrice once used my interest to buy herself a place in society, laughing at my pale skin behind my back, he said, his red eyes fixed on hers. I thought every mortal smile was a trick designed to steal my gold. But when I saw you on that bridge, cold and shivering, giving away your only protection to someone you didn't know, I realized I had been hiding from the wrong things. You have never performed for me, Hazel. You have never tried to charm me with false words. You are the only real thing I have found in 40 years of traveling, and I will not let your family hide you away any longer. Hazel looked at him, the tears she had held back for years finally sliding down her cheeks. I was taught to believe I was worth only what I could provide for others, she whispered. It is very strange to hear that I am worth something simply because I exist. Nathaniel stepped closer, his cool fingers gently brushing a tear from her cheek. You are worth more than this entire valley, Hazel, he said, his voice low and certain. And I intend to spend the next 100 years ensuring you never forget it, if you will allow a creature of the dark to walk beside you. The months that followed the ball brought a quiet peace to the valley of Pine Ridge, as the winter slowly gave way to the early signs of spring. The scandal at the town hall eventually faded from the gossip columns, replaced by the news of a quiet wedding to be held at the small stone chapel near the northern woods. Martha Montgomery, realizing her daughter's future was secure with a fortune larger than any she could have dreamed of, accepted the match with a silent, grudging dignity, choosing to live quietly in the city on an allowance Nathaniel provided. Lily stayed behind at Crestview Manor for a long time, her pride wounded, but her mind finally opening to the truth of her sister's life. One evening, before the spring flowers began to bloom, Lily came up to the small room under the eaves where Hazel was packing the last of her grandmother's things into a cedar chest. Lily stood in the doorway, her golden hair tied back simply, without her usual jewels. I was taught that beauty was a currency, Hazel, Lily said, her voice small and entirely free of the old sharpness. I thought if I smiled correctly, the world owed me a fortune, and I never stopped to think about the work you did to keep the roof over our heads. Watching him look at you made me realize that his kind of love cannot be bought with a practiced waltz. I want to learn how to be a real person, sister, but I do not know where to start. Hazel rose from the chest and walked across the room, taking Lily's hands in her own. You start by looking at people instead of their mirrors, Lily, Hazel said softly, pulling her sister into a warm, gentle embrace. We were both trapped by mother's numbers, just in different directions. I do not hold any anger against you. The wedding took place on a bright April morning, the stone chapel decorated not with expensive silk ribbons or city imports, but with branches of wild white pine and early mountain laurel that Hazel had gathered herself from the hills. Mrs. Gable sat in the front bench, wearing her finest lace shawl and crying into a white handkerchief, while Lily stood beside her sister, with a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in her youth. Hazel walked down the short stone aisle in her grandmother's emerald silk dress, her dark hair bound with a simple silver comb Nathaniel had given her. As she reached the altar where Nathaniel stood, his white hair catching the morning sun and his pale hand extended toward her, she looked out at the future with a calm, settled heart. The old woman from the frozen bridge sat in the rear pew, wrapped in a new wool cloak of deep blue, her sharp eyes reflecting the light of the altar candles, as she watched the girl who had saved her life take her place as the queen of a reclusive king. Standing there in the warmth of the spring morning, looking at the pale hand clutched in her own, Hazel let go of the old arithmetic that had governed her childhood. She understood at last that life was not a ledger to be balanced through sacrifice and denial, nor was it a performance to be staged for the approval of a crowd. Her thoughts drifted forward to the long years ahead in the great stone manor on the hill. Years she would spend not as an invisible servant to another's ambition, but as a partner fully seen and deeply valued by a man who had traveled through centuries of darkness just to find her simple warmth. Kindness, she realized as the bells began to ring across the valley, was the only currency that never lost its value in the winter, and the coldest road she had ever walked had led her directly to the most enduring sanctuary of her life.